Hi, it's Sherry at Savvy Business Resolutions with another episode of Investing in Conversation, Conflict Management for Managers. Following last week's programme, which was all about the spoken word, this time, with the help of a couple of guests, one of whom you've heard before, we'll bust a myth, I'll speak from experience, and between us we'll give you a tip, all relating to where we harness the power of speech for work. So we come to this week's myth. Tech lets us work anywhere. Well, yeah, okay, technically it does. But just because we can, doesn't always mean we should. Not all workspaces are created equal. I'm guessing most of us have shared an office at some time, and maybe you still do. I'll tell you about one of my experiences later. But whether you share a big open plan space or something resembling an oversized cupboard, the biggest challenge tends to be the same: other people. Now, I'm not antisocial, far from it. I work alone a lot these days, and I do miss the company of colleagues. But whatever kind of space we share and whoever we share it with, it's so easy to end up disagreeing about everything from how the place looks to how it smells. I mean, I love the smell of fresh coffee, but I have a colleague who can't stand it, so if we were to work in the same space, we'd have a problem. Sometimes these things are just little niggles, but every now and then one of those niggles grows up to be a full-blown falling out. Either that or it escalates other underlying issues. The trouble is that however well we get on, we humans are so awkwardly individual about the spaces we work in, or anything else come to that. One size very rarely fits all. Dr. Jennifer Veitch of the National Research Council of Canada has been heavily involved in researching the link between light and health. She and her colleagues have established that our well-being, physical, psychological and social, depends on a strong light-dark cycle through the 24-hour period. But as she says, it's extremely difficult to translate that into firm guidelines for workplaces.
I can be quite general in saying people need a big difference between a bright light exposure during the day and a very dark night. It's very difficult to give a very precise number for how bright that bright number should be. One of the differences being that we're finding there are very broad differences between individuals and what they need.
Right.
That makes it difficult to write a standard that says everybody should get this. Now, one of the other interesting things, however, is an independent line of research that I and some others worked on. What we know from that line is that there are these huge individual differences in the level of light people prefer. This accounts for why I like my home to be quite bright and my husband likes it not to be so bright, and we have some conflict over that.
Even purpose-built workspaces aren't always completely fit for purpose, especially when that purpose is the activity which is at the heart of conflict and resolution: communication. In the first episode of this series, I spoke to Julian Treasure, an expert on how sound affects us, about noise, conflict and listening. He says some of the sound barriers we run into at work come out of a conflict between design and use and are quite literally built in.
A lot of architects are designing buildings without knowing what they're going to be used for. Even they're designing for a client who's an investor who's building a building, and down the line that building gets let to somebody. The function isn't always clear when the building's being designed. So there's a little bit of a dislocate there. And there's also a kind of post-industrial modernist approach where people these days love not having suspended ceilings, for example, and having just the cable trays and the concrete exposed above. It's considered to be cool and trendy. So
Yes.
we end up in rooms that really are not fit for purpose, unfortunately, acoustically. Rooms with long reverberation time, rooms with parallel surfaces where the result is standing waves and flutter echoes that are very disturbing. Rooms where it's very difficult to understand people talking, and the noise level in those rooms, due to a thing called the Lombard effect, tends to escalate. This is a spiral upwards, where if I'm speaking a bit loud, you have to speak louder, and then I speak a bit louder again, and we keep doing that.
If you need to deal with a conflict at work, you might decide to get everyone round the table to talk about it, not unreasonably. But Julian says if you work in one of those trendy offices, the meeting room itself could be working against you.
We get these hideous little glass and stone boxes with hard chairs, hard table, everything hard in there, and the sound is just awful. It's creating rows, not meetings.
In the show on listening, Julian touched briefly on the impact of noise on our health, particularly how chronic exposure to 65 decibels or more increases our risk of cardiovascular disease. Here, he explains what that means for our social health.
Stress hormones get released. That's been established by researchers in offices who've been measuring through skin conduction and blood tests. They've measured the release of stress hormones, and they found that noisy offices cause stress hormones to be released. So you've got people who are stressed. That makes people tired. It makes them irritable. It makes them less sociable. It makes them less involved in teamwork. There are all sorts of effects. So you'll end up with high staff turnover because it's just not a nice place to work. You'll end up with absenteeism because people are sick. All sorts of effects like that.
The fact is, noise causes stress, which causes conflict, which causes stress, and before you know where you are, you're caught in a vicious downward spiral. Noise can be an issue in any shared workspace, but generally it scales up with the size of the area and the number of people using it. Yet blindingly obvious, I know, but that's why I mention it. The original purpose of the large open plan office was to make admin and clerical work more efficient. It was all about industrialising those things just after the Industrial Revolution. More recently, advocates of open plan have emphasised the benefits to collaboration. Can't argue with that. But I've seen a shift over the last few years. As more and more companies whose staff have worked from home since the pandemic are trying to get them back into the office, at the same time as costs are rising, efficiency is very much back on the table. But Julian warns against false economy.
If you cram people into an office, you may save cost. You do not improve productivity. Actually, what you do is decimate productivity. There are surveys which show that people's productivity in open plan offices, if they're trying to do concentration type work, their productivity can be reduced by up to 66%, two-thirds less.
In a time of rising energy costs, Jennifer has a similar message when it comes to lighting.
One of the important things for managers of organizations to remember is that even in Europe, where energy costs are much higher than where I live, it's still the case that the cost of the employees is considerably more than the cost of the environment they're providing for the employees. So although one also does have to put a value on the environmental side of the equation, the energy use side, it's important to realize that when you're doing that cost benefit on your particular case, if you make the wrong choice and it costs your employees in their ability to work or their commitment to your organization, that's a very expensive mistake for your organization. And they don't need to be objectively ill to be not as effective at work and not as effective working together with others in teams. Managing conflict is a huge amount of the time of any manager. So anything that creates more conflict among employees is not going to be helpful to the organization.
Now, I'm always talking about turning obstacles into opportunities, aren't I? You'll know this if you've been with me since the beginning of the series and if you've been reading the blog. But every now and then, the reverse happens. Sometimes, even the opportunity I'm asking you to invest in can become an obstacle. Julian again.
Conversation is the most distracting sound of all. We're programmed to decode language. We're hardwired to do that, and it's very difficult if somebody's talking next to you. You're doing the work to decode it. You're listening without wanting to listen.
Earlier on, I said I would share one of my first-hand experiences of sharing an office. Painful first-hand experience. What happened was, back in 1994, I got a job with a wills and probate company. Rules around all that kind of thing were loosening up a bit, and there were a number of people, non-legal people, shall I say jumping on the bandwagon? Yeah, well, I just did. So anyway, I was offered a post in one of these companies, and my brief was to develop a broader legal department because I was legally trained and my bosses weren't. And I was very happy to do it. So I was given a lovely big office, desk in the middle, big windows, beautiful. Everything was wonderful for about 2 weeks. And then we were all called together on the Friday afternoon and the bosses dropped their bombshell. The branch office was closing, so all the telesales team were coming across to headquarters. So we're all sat there looking at each other going, where are we going to put them? Yeah, you guessed it. In my lovely office. So for the next 6 months, I was trying to be a lawyer in a telesales office, and I can tell you it was a nightmare. I mean, they were a lovely bunch of guys. They really were. I've got nothing against them. But, oh, boy, they drove me insane. I would be there trying to deal with a sensitive phone call. I might have a meeting. I might have letters to write or documents to draft. You name it. All against the backdrop of the same damn telesales script. 5 different people going through the same script, all at different stages. I loved my job, but I used to leave work every night with a headache and feeling exhausted. I mean, I was young and fit in those days, but I felt so tired. And of course, I know now the reason I felt so tired was because I was frantically filtering all that information I didn't want all day long. I also used to worry about confidentiality because, as I said, I was talking to sometimes the bereaved relatives of former clients or opposing lawyers on different cases. And I did worry that I was sharing information that really shouldn't be shared. Probably the telesales team were so intent on what they were doing, focusing on their caller and their script, they didn't hear anything I said. But it was a concern. It was an added stress. The biggest issue for me was having no choice, having nowhere else to go, no escape route. My tip for you this week is, I know you can't create ideal working conditions for everybody. It would be wonderful if you could, but in reality, you can only do what you can do with the resources you have available. But what you can do is try to give yourself or your team some choice over where they work. For instance, if your office is a noisy place because there are lots of calls going out and coming in, or because people are using it for its best possible purpose, collaboration, and somebody needs to do some concentration work, create the option to take the work somewhere more suitable. It might be at home. It might be the library. It could be the cafe down the road. It doesn't really matter. The fact is, pick the place to fit the task. Otherwise, the place will shape the task. I'm always saying, aren't I? Context shapes content. Well, this is a prime example. When you try to carry out the wrong task in the wrong place, it will compromise the performance and the productivity. My 2 guests on this show come at their subjects from very different angles. Jennifer's an academic and Julian runs a business working with other organisations. But they do agree on the role of control.
If you think you have a way out, then that helps in and of itself, even if you never use that way out. That's a well-known psychology finding from 40 years ago now. It also carries through to their engagement in the work, so their degree of focus when they're working on tasks, carries on into their opinion of the aesthetic appreciation of the room they're in, their satisfaction with the working environment, and interestingly, with their satisfaction with their jobs and their commitment to the organization they work for. Although the effects are not huge, the fact that anybody can say that the ability to control light has this knock-on effect for whether or not the organization has a high degree of turnover, or incidentally also in the number of health problems people complain of at work, is really huge because those are outcomes that are very costly for organizations.
Definitely control is very important. If we have selected the environment, whether it's a noisy cafe or whether it's a quiet library, if we've selected that, then we feel much happier than if the environment is imposed on us and there's nothing we can do. So control definitely has an effect. If you have a bad environment and it's been imposed on people, they feel twice as bad as if they chose to go into a bad environment themselves.
Yes.
And to put up with it for a while.
Finally, as Julian points out, The power of choice has to come with some responsibility.
This isn't just top down, this has to be bottom up. We can create environments where there's quiet working space, there's social working space, there's all sorts of lovely different working spaces. We still, all of us, have to take responsibility to listen and say, am I in the best place for what I'm trying to do? And move ourselves if we're not.
Now, if you've been listening for a while, you know I always like to finish the show on a light note. And I'll be honest with you, I was struggling a little bit with this subject. And then I remembered my first radio series. I was lucky enough to learn most of what I know about presenting and producing audio in very nice London studios. I was, to be honest, spoiled. So when I came to do my first live radio show, it was a bit of a culture shock. You see, our studios were at the top of a shopping centre. We had a lovely view of the top of the multi-storey car park. But as you can imagine, that's not exactly an environment purpose-built for radio. The reason I say our studios is because the walls were those screens that you use in offices. You know, the things, the sort of slightly padded things that you use to cut noise down. So you can move them around. In fact, one afternoon on one show, I was working with the boss and I was doing my show. She was making contributions. And somebody down the corridor, I'm not going to say in the next room because it wasn't, but somebody down the corridor beyond the screen was recording a radio show at full volume. And my manager got so fed up with this that in the end, she just stood up so casually and went, excuse me a moment, I'm just going to move the wall. In that context, that was a perfectly normal thing to say, but when I look back on it, it's completely bizarre. The most challenging time, though, was when I was trying to do a show and the car park was being repaired with a road drill. Yeah. The worst of it was, every time I played a record, the guys stopped drilling. But the minute I started to speak, to do a link, they started again. Now, I mean, I'm not paranoid, but I did get to a point where I thought, they must be listening. This is deliberate. In the end, all my colleague and I could do was laugh at it. Although after that, where and whenever I could, I did record my programmes at home and send them in. I'll come back to that on the next show, because we're going to be talking about time. Till then, let me wish you a peaceful and productive week, and I'll talk to you next time. If you need help with any aspect of conflict management at work, come and talk to me. All my details are on the website, savvybusinessresolutions.com.